Now, these public lectures are being presented by some of the most innovative people working worldwide in the arts today. The series was originally established in 2014 as part of the centennial celebrations of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And this was one of the many institutions and organisations that was established by the Scottish-born philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. He donated much of the wealth that he generated to help improve society, with a particular focus on education. It also led to the foundation of the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland in 1901. Now, with these lectures, by allowing the university access to key arts practitioners and researchers, they're allowing us to develop and enhance the research culture of Edinburgh College of Art as a whole, and also to contribute to a wider global arts agenda. The talks each year are combined with the speakers taking part in discussions and workshops with staff and students from ECA. And tonight I'm delighted to introduce Fergus Linehan as our speaker for the Andrew Carnegie Lecture. Fergus will be known to many people in the room as the incredibly successful director of our Edinburgh International Festival, who presented his third festival earlier this year. Now, that was the 70th festival, and the founding principles about using culture to bring the people of the world together in a period of intense international uncertainty and conflict seem almost as necessary and relevant now as in those early years after World War II. We're delighted that his term as festival director has recently been extended, and so we can look forward to another 5 years of festivals under his direction. Fergus began his career in the theatre in Dublin, producing work for independent companies and going on to direct the Dublin Theatre Festival. During that time, he commissioned work by many of Ireland's leading writers, including Seamus Heaney and Brian Friel, and presented the Irish premieres of work by directors such as Peter Brook and Deborah Warner. From 2004 to 2009, Fergus was Chief Executive and Artistic Director of the Sydney Festival, where he presented performances by artists such as Christopher Wheeldon and Björk. From 2010 to 2012, Fergus was Head of Music at Sydney Opera House, and from 2012 to 2014 was Festival Director of Vivid Live, an annual event celebrating popular music and digital art. Fergus's first 3 seasons at the Edinburgh International Festival have achieved enormous popular and critical acclaim, and he's really succeeded in opening up the festival to the city in particularly innovative and exciting ways, with thrilling open-air free public events on the opening nights for the last 3 years that the college has been delighted to partner the festival in putting on. Deep engagement with the city's young people, particularly from Castlebrae School. An evening with brass bands playing right across the city, and of course turning the city yellow with those wonderful banners welcoming the world. Throughout all his programmes, he's brought the best of the world to Edinburgh and taken the best of Edinburgh and Scottish arts to the world. So I'm delighted now to introduce Fergus Linehan as our speaker this evening and to invite him to present his lecture, Who is Really Running the Show? Fergus.
Thank you, Dorothy. Good evening. I'd like to thank the Edinburgh College of Art and all at the University of Edinburgh for the invitation to address you tonight. I'd like to thank you all for coming on a freezing night. It's a little bit freezing in here too, but hopefully it's going to warm up. I did wonder when I was invited to do this lecture, was it a question of who'd be stupid enough to follow Brian Eno? There must have been a short list of people because I know it was a wonderful lecture. This is always a bit tricky for me because normally when I stand up, I am just talking about our program and talking about our projects, and this is a very different brief tonight. And it's always interesting, but to be honest, challenging to also address a group that's immersed in rigorous academic research. I'm painfully conscious that my thoughts and opinions are just that. not supported with the sort of research and verifiable facts that can legitimize them, which is a sort of anathema to academic thinking. I really just offer a sort of barstool wisdom based on that most unreliable of sources, hunches and instinct, which I know for most academics that way madness lies. But I'm afraid that's what I can do, I suppose, is give you a snapshot from the trenches. I think that, when someone in my shoes offers up a theory on a matter, we're often allowed to get away with it without sort of having a list of verifiable facts to back it up. On the other hand, when someone from the academic world offers up a thesis or an opinion, they're not immediately collared and asked what they're going to do about it. So things sort of balance themselves out, perhaps. So what I want to talk about tonight, it doesn't amount to a thesis or what I would call a comprehensive analysis of a subject, but rather a series of observations that I hope come from an interesting perspective. I actually, is a colleague of mine, the way this is laid out has been a matter of great hilarity at my work, I have to say, because someone sort of said, well, we'll all put this up as our screensaver just in case we're ever in any doubt as to who is really running the show. I thought who is really running the show, and then down small would be a lecture by Fergus Linehan, not who's really running the show. Fergus Linehan is really running the show. But I did want to talk about power in the arts, and as I say, I kind of wanted to address this question of power, and maybe the way it's laid out is actually a provocation of sorts, because it looks like I am a megalomaniac kind of control freak who's telling everyone what to do. But the reason I settled on this subject is that the question of power and the use of power and the abuse of power, indeed, in our industry has been debated and discussed at length in recent months. And there has been an investigation to see if the particular kind of protocols and hierarchies that exist seem to have left the arts and entertainment industries open to these sort of extraordinary behaviors. And I think what most agree on is that to understand the nature of these behaviors, we need to understand where power lies and how it's applied. And this led me to thinking about this and thinking how little people understand the nature of power in our industry. Anyone who's in our particular industry at the moment as well is pulling together their budgets and plans for next year. And so we feel in a very tangible sense the different forces pulling us this direction and that. But I think I'd better start by telling you a little bit about myself, because I had what I realize now was quite an unusual upbringing. Obviously, everyone's childhood feels normal until you're at the other end of it. But it did give me a very particular perspective on artists and arts institutions. This is my mum and dad. My mum is Rosalie Linehan, an actress, and my father was Fergus Linehan, and he was the arts editor of the Irish Times and was a playwright. So I grew up in a house completely immersed in the arts, which made really no distinction between what we might call high art and low art. My parents were at the vanguard of comedy in Ireland. That's really where their career began. The Beyond the Fringe of its day in Ireland was led by my parents, and my mum was sort of the leading lady. There she is with Milo O'Shea and Des Keogh. And then they went into musical theatre in quite a big bit. This is a wonderful musical my parents wrote called Merry Make-Believe, and my mother performed in it. So comedy and musical theatre were very much kind of a part of my upbringing. And then my mother moved into what you might call straight acting, and this is a production of Happy Days she did with the director Carol Rice, and Carol went on, and then she went on to make a film of it. And performed in Dancing at Luna on Broadway and in the West End, and sort of blossomed into this sort of major theatre career. And she's still working at 81, she's still working. She always calls herself the go-to Irish bag for all casting. Thankfully a role that is plentiful. So she still works. But but it was interesting. My father was a film critic, and that's my brother, who's a classically trained pianist. So I grew up with artists all around me, and as I say, I grew up not fully understanding the distinction between high and low art. But I also grew up because my father had sort of oversight of the arts in his role as the arts editor of the Irish Times, understanding the institutional side of it as well. But I think kind of crucially, most people run away to the circus. There's a moment where their journey into the arts is a rejection of what they were brought up in, whereas I just went into the family business. I didn't run away to the circus, I was born in the circus. So I actually am probably the most conventional of all people in that sense. So I was wondering where to begin this question. I thought one of the media's perennial favorites, the power lists, the obsession with power lists. Maybe we could start there. So here's the Art Review's list of the most powerful people in visual arts. And here's the Times list of the most powerful people in London theatre. They're all basically people like me. I think there's a few striking features here. Firstly, there's almost no artists on the list. And those that are there by dint of their administrative or curatorial work rather than their practice. There's no real donors or sponsors on any of these lists. So the people whose funds often dictate what we do don't really exist on it. And the public aren't really represented in any way on them. And by that, no public funders, no heads of arts councils or ministers or cabinet secretaries. So they are in truth incredibly incomplete lists, but I understand how they've come to be. And at their core, I think, is a sort of misunderstanding of the swirling, shifting agendas at play within the arts today, but also, I'd argue, that have been at play for a very, very long time. One of the questions I constantly get asked is how a festival program is put together. Sometimes it's referred as the mists of programming in our organization. But what is the actual selection process? And it's a difficult question to answer, but perhaps it's a good place to start. Festivals are perhaps more ephemeral than any other arts institution. We generally don't have a building. We tend not to have ensembles or collections of artists. We burn very brightly for an incredibly finite amount of time. So all a festival is a context. It's a particular combination of things. It is a way of framing work, and perhaps it's a way of synthesizing work. So with a festival, and in particular a festival with a multi-genre remit, it can be almost anything. And within that comes enormous freedom, but also some real challenges. I regularly have people berating me for not including their particular area of interest in the programming. I think we're all having a drink downstairs later, so I hope you do come and tell me what particular area I'm failing you in. But I will have people say, why so little contemporary visual art? Why don't we have any classical ballet? Why so little contemporary composition? Where is my big Monet blockbuster exhibition? I think that we're relatively lucky, or I'm relatively lucky anyway, in this city, that there's a history of leaving the festival director to get on with it. But I think that it's fair to say that while being left to get on with it, you're left to get on with it in the context of an understanding of what the festival is, and that you will hold together a particular alliance of interests that include the wider cultural sector, a large and engaged public, government agencies, local, national, international, and a family of donors and sponsors. So that's a pretty big caveat to your blank piece of paper. And I think that within that, you can see power being exercised in ways that are often overt, and at times are covert, and indeed at times that are unintentional. So I'd like to start with the question of patronage, how the public or the ruling class holds a certain power over the arts. In last year's festival, we celebrated the 450th anniversary of the birth of the Italian composer Claudio Monteverdi. And we presented 3 of his operas, L'Orfeo, The Return of Ulysses, and The Coronation of Poppaea. Each in their own way reflects the belief system that concerned the Venetian commercial aristocracy of the time, a celebration of the spirit of the ancient Roman Republic, and a repudiation of the decadence and corruption of the Roman Empire, which was a thinly veiled dig at the Rome of the day. So I think you can see throughout history that patronage, whether it's royal, commercial, or governmental, usually has an agenda at work. And that agenda is not always explicit, and sometimes you have to look very carefully to understand what it is. I wanted to take 2 organisations that essentially do the same thing. The Royal Opera House in London and the Paris Opera Ballet in Paris. They both produce operas and ballets. They both have education and outreach programs, and they both receive significant sums of public funding. So I wanted to show 2 little short pieces of film which give an idea about how they want to be understood by their paymasters, but also how they want to be understood by the public at large. So let's have a look at these and we'll try and pull apart the agendas at work. I think we'll start with the Paris Opera.
Est-ce qu'on a le chef?
Le maestro est sur le plateau.
C'est bon. Entrée du chef.
C'est la première année que l'Opéra de Paris va produire 9 productions nouvelles d'opéra et 8 productions nouvelles de ballet. C'est le seul théâtre, non seulement qui a 2 salles, et c'est le seul qui a une production de ballet et de lyrique à ce niveau-là. Là, tu répètes 1 an, donc forcément leur engagement est par nature exceptionnel.
Juste. Il faudrait pas que le poids, on sente... Il faudrait que ça soit... Tu vois, ouais.
Tous les chœurs du monde traînent. Notre chœur, c'est un chœur qui presse.
On a les contraintes qui se rapprochent là du côté des syndicats, on a les contraintes qui se rapprochent là du côté de l'État, et avec ça, il faut faire plus de spectacles, des spectacles plus beaux.
Ils veulent pas voir le taureau en dehors de sa cage.
S'il veut faire le con, il peut mettre lui, faire une chape.
Il lui a passé du Schönberg, la peinture, sans arrêt.
I am from a small village in Russia.
Ja, bitte da unten direkt da.
Ah, der Gott ist Gott.
Aujourd'hui, c'est très important.
So, everyone in the film is white. The voices of authority almost are exclusively older and male. There's a hushed, fearful reverence for all of the figures of authority. God is coming. And there's no children or young people anywhere to be seen. Everything is prestigious, epic, and exquisite. And in the end, they raise the French flag over Paris like soldiers proclaiming victory. Now let's flip over and have a look at the way the Royal Opera House speaks to the public and its stakeholders.
What do you see? Glitz and glamour, art for the elite and expensive seats. What happens here comes from sweat and tears, from talent and ambition, from energy and vision. This is creativity that goes beyond the city. No ostentation. This is art for the nation. This is more than just a stage. This is dramatic prowess. This is backstage finesse, stirring the soul of both young and old. This is community. This ignites passions and provokes debate, sparks imagination and inspires creation. Now look again and tell me, what do you see?
So it's roller skates and angle grinders and workshops. And both of these films are effectively exaggerations. I've been to both of these opera houses many times, and I've never seen prime ministers and movie stars at the Paris Opera, and I've never seen hip-hop kids doing backflips in the foyers of Covent Garden. But it definitely begins to tell you a little bit about the political agendas that are at work. As I say, both are exaggerations. In France, I think the suggestion is that elegance and indeed ostentation is to be celebrated, that the French flag bestrides the cultural world. In the UK, a careful mashup of the language of government, community, art for the nation, inspiration and creativity. And so we see the agendas of the public sector and indeed the sympathies of the public playing out as clear as day, and just how different they are. I couldn't help thinking when I saw that of another statue there. See, an academic would never do that. That's just a cheap trick. Interestingly, the total subsidy for the Paris Opera Ballet is £85 million, while that for the Royal Opera House is closer to £26 million. And in the UK, I think we often look on enviously at our continental neighbours, and we imagine a life less pressured than the need to generate 60, 70 or 80% of our income from box office or sponsorship and donors. We imagine perhaps that the power, so to speak, in that circumstance returns to the artistic directorate. But I don't think that's right. I think that there's no doubt that the need to, what is politely called, diversify income streams has resulted in a much more balanced governance structure. And in a sense, I think no one stakeholder has absolute power over our institutions. In France, this clearly isn't the case. I mean, if you consider the case of Olivier P., who was artistic director of the Odeon Theatre in Paris, and P was coming to the end of an extraordinarily successful 5-year period at the helm of the Odeon. All of the performances were packed and the critics were fulsome in their praise, and all of the major actors wanted to work with him. So everyone expected his contract to be renewed, but suddenly out of the blue, it was announced that he would be leaving the theatre. And there are those that note that P's recent hit play about the socialist president Francois Mitterrand, which exposed him as a Philistine and a political lightweight, may have irritated the culture minister Frédéric Mitterrand, nephew of the great Francois, allegedly. So I think that for all of the independence that our European colleagues enjoy, the price that they pay is that they are subject to a kind of direct level of control that I think would be regarded as completely unacceptable in the UK and probably the US as well. Of course, all of this is mild-mannered compared to the absolute control exercised by various despots and authoritarian figures over the years. Artists such as Dmitry Shostakovich had to endure cloaked threats about his failure to reflect the spirit of the Soviet people and his continuing dalliance with decadent formalism. After the release of his Ninth Symphony, Shostakovich had to issue a grovelling apology, writing, "I know the party is right. I shall try again and again to create symphonic words close to the spirit of the people." Finding examples of where donors have used their power to radically influence the direction of arts institutions is more complex, because their influence is usually exerted behind closed doors and the individuals in question are terrifyingly litigious. And as this is going out on Vimeo afterwards, I don't think I'm going to mention any names. However, I do think it's fair to say that there's a healthy debate at the moment about the impact of this shift towards earned income in the makeup of the governance of our institutions. In the US, many arts boards as you will know, are made up of donors primarily. There's a give or get off mantra. And similarly, the role of the president of the large arts organizations in the US are primarily focused on the fundraising function. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't mean that there are wonderful people involved and perhaps with very well thought through intentions, but if the entire governance body and the senior executive of an organization are spending most of their time focusing on fundraising in its various forms, it does follow that the interests and desires of donors and individuals are going to have to be at the forefront of their minds. In a completely different way, I just recall another organisation I worked for, the Dublin Theatre Festival, and which began in 1957. And in 1958, the festival almost collapsed, having only had one edition, because the Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid, here with Eamon de Valera, the sort of statesman, the founder of our constitution, refused to give his blessing by way of a festival service because he didn't approve of the fact that there were works, particularly by Sean O'Casey, but also James Joyce, included in the festival programme. O'Casey's play, The Drums of Father Ned, was cancelled because the proposed changes made the piece unworkable, and Joyce's play was quietly dropped. So Samuel Beckett withdrew a work in protest. He really had insulted the trifecta of Irish literary life at this point. But the festival essentially was cancelled. And this was really just a word from the Archbishop. It was really just a nudge and a suggestion from him that he didn't approve, and what has grown to become one of the most important institutions in Irish cultural life was almost obliterated. And it'll give you a sense of the extraordinary power of the church in Ireland at that time. So I do wonder if we are in a relatively healthy position here in the UK, where the balance of revenues from the public, or the tickets or book buying, or whatever way it wants to put it, revenue from individuals and sponsors, and then revenues from the public purse, create a natural balance where no one voice can dominate the agenda. Indeed, I also think that possibly the dialogue between those different stakeholders and interest groups can be very healthy and keep us honest in a way. There is, however, a trend over the past number of decades that I think is worth observing, not just here in Scotland, but all around the world, and that of increased instrumentalism. And this is a difficult one, because on the one hand, I fully believe that public money should be connected into strategic government objectives, and I believe it should have measurable outcomes. And then on the other, I know that there is a danger that artists and the rather unpredictable and messy business of making art feels it has to accommodate an agenda which is driven by economic impacts, questions of social inclusion, educational projects, professional development, therapeutic programs, new technologies, urban regeneration, youth unemployment, and the wider impacts of the creator industry. And obviously that list just keeps going and going. And on the one hand, that's hugely important and exciting that the arts have the capacity to sit at the very heart of public life and address these very crucial issues. But I am also very conscious of the need to articulate that all of these benefits flow from the imagination of the artist, and there has to be a fundamental contract of trust that accepts that there are limits to how prescriptive we should be, and there has to be room for things to grow and develop in directions that we cannot anticipate. And I fully appreciate that that creates a real problem for the arts and also a real problem for government, but one obviously that is in a constant state of negotiation. I think at this point I better talk a little bit about the Edinburgh International Festival. Earlier this year, as Dorothy mentioned, we celebrated our 70th anniversary. It was the anniversary of the International Festival, of the Fringe, and of the Film Festival. And during the run-up to the festival, we spent a lot of time looking and talking about the founding principles. And indeed, there was a great sense of pride in August that Edinburgh had created this event of international standing founded on the principles of global cooperation and collaboration. And I think that given the rise of nativism in many parts of the world, we had this festival, which was an event founded by a Jewish refugee that had enriched our city in so many ways. And this really felt, I think, from a civic and political and commercial point of view, just to be something worth celebrating and wearing with pride. But within a discussion about power, I think that there are some really interesting factors at play in the founding years of the festival. I want to play a short piece from the BBC's documentary Civilization, a very short piece, which was created and presented by Kenneth Clark, just by way of a segue.
Looking at those great works of Western man, and remembering all that he's achieved in philosophy, poetry, science, lawmaking, it does seem hard to believe that European civilization can ever vanish. And yet, you know, it has happened once. All the life-giving human activities that we lump together under the word civilization have been obliterated once in Western Europe, when the barbarians ran over the Roman Empire. For 2 centuries, the heart of European civilization almost stopped beating. We got through by the skin of our teeth. In the last few years, we developed an uneasy feeling that this could happen again. And advanced thinkers, who even in Roman times thought it fine to gang up with the barbarians, have begun to question if civilization is worth preserving. Well, this is why it seems to me a good moment to look at some of the ways in which man has shown himself to be an intelligent, creative, orderly, and compassionate animal. And the time to begin looking is the time when the old world of Greece and Rome had collapsed and the new world of Western Europe had not produced anything that one could call civilization. What is civilization? I don't know. I can't define it in abstract terms yet, but I think I can recognize it when I see it, and I'm looking at it now.
I think the phrase that strikes me here is, or the phrase is his description of the ideal civilized man, an intelligent, creative, orderly, and compassionate animal. And I think that this idea of order is one that recurs a lot in the early writings about the festival. I'm reminded of a quote from the sermon at the opening service where the minister of St. Giles said, "This festival is a testimony to the harmony which is at the heart of creation. It witnesses to the survival power of beauty amid ugliness, of harmony amid discord, of truth amid insincerity, fake and lies. Let us then offer our festival to the glory of God and let its music challenge the strident noises of the world." So there's an idea there that the study of art, and primarily Western classical art, would act as a sort of calming balm after the shrillness of the war, and would have a civilizing effect upon those who experienced it. Another way of looking at it is that the war had fractured the order of things, and a study of the classics under the watchful eye of the establishment in the city of the Enlightenment would guide it back to sanity, reason, and compassion. Perhaps a cynic might add that part of this order was to restate the authority of the state, the church, and the ruling class. Even though the Fringe is often understood as the child of some plucky give-it-a-go upstarts, it's actually worth remembering that it was the Glasgow Unity Theatre with its strong links to the Communist Party of Great Britain that really got the Fringe going. So in my opinion, I think there's a power struggle playing out in 1947 here in Edinburgh. So while the Lord Provost of Edinburgh grandly wrote of establishing an incorruptible love of truth to create a lofty spirit of freedom and to blend a moral and intellectual guiding force of the world, the poet Hugh MacDiarmid was writing in The Scotsman that it's to my mind absurd that a city which has always treated the arts so meanly can suddenly blossom forth as a great centre of world culture. He adds, it's like giving the content of a university honours course all at once to a class of mentally defective children. Also, I think within Rudolf Bing's assertion that any Scottish contributions would be regimental sword dances, Scottish folk dances, and bagpipe music, we can see a very clear understanding in his belief that this intellectual guiding force in the future of the world was not going to come from Scotland. Scotland was a very nice backdrop for this work, which would come from London and Paris and Berlin. So there is therefore within the genesis of Edinburgh as a festival city, there is a battle playing out as to what art and culture is, where it should come from, and how it should be valued. The festival is often referred to as important in terms of Scotland and the United Kingdom's place in the world. And this brings us to one of the more recent buzzwords in cultural policy, which is soft power, a phrase coined by Joseph Nye in the late 1980s, which is described in different ways, but roughly the ability of a country to persuade others to do what it wants to do without force or coercion. Now, we're really wandering onto some thin ice here, because everyone likes the idea of cultural collaboration and of international cooperation, but the conversation around soft power is sharpening into something much more direct. Certainly in China, the drive to increase soft power accelerated following an essay by the then president Hu Jintao in 2010, when he wrote, "Hostile international powers are strengthening their efforts to westernize and divide us. We must be aware of the seriousness and complexity of the struggles and take powerful measures to prevent and deal with them. The international culture of the West is strong while we are weak." So you see here the question of soft power and the role of culture within it really coming into the very center of foreign policy and the conversation within government at the highest level. Soft power is one of the most elusive influences at play in the arts. We all acknowledge that it exists and that it's important, and yet its funding and its strategic planning are often opaque. Almost no organization has a line in their income stream dedicated to it, in the way it does for pretty much all other instrumentalist policies. And very few artists would like to think of themselves as a tool of government in this way. Increasingly, members of the public will intervene if they sense that the presentation of a work of art is being used to validate or gloss over the behaviours of a government. And this causes great challenges for many artists and indeed for many festivals, because if you're presenting an international festival with artists from all over the world, in any given year we will face discord which ranges from complaint through to protest regarding the appearance at the festival of an artist or a company. And the question here is, how far can the arts go and should the arts go in their engagement with the machinations of foreign policy? Certainly if the public feels that the artists or ensembles are being used as symbols, not just of a nation's culture, but also of a particular administration, it follows that they're going to be a lightning rod for protest. The question of soft power as well causes real dilemmas for artists. A recent example is the case of the music director of the Simón Bolívar Orchestra and El Sistema in Venezuela, Gustavo Dudamel. Over the past number of years, Gustavo has come under increasing pressure to condemn the actions of the Venezuelan government. However, the international profile of that organization and all the young people in it, and the tours which pay for the work of the organization, are to a large degree dependent on his involvement. So earlier this year he wrote that he urgently calls upon the President of the Republic to rectify and listen to the voices of the Venezuelan people. It is time to listen to the people, enough is enough. Sentiment that I imagine many people here would agree with. But as a result of this, many of the tours which he had planned to lead across the world and provide vital funds and profile for El Sistema and its orchestras have now been cancelled, as the Venezuelan government refuses to issue exit visas for a project with which he's involved. So this remains a burning issue for leaders of institutions from Russia to Israel and all across the world. And if you are leading an institution, the degree to which you can continue to work with an administration and the degree to which the statement that makes about your complicity with that particular administration. I mean, these issues point to the rather obvious fact that artists live in the real world, and their lives and their practice is subject to the priorities and the tastes of powerful people just as much as us in the civilian world, and in some cases even more so. Of course, some artists seek power and money. Andy Warhol famously proclaimed, "Making money is art, and working is art, and good business is art." For the record, I do not agree with him. Artists often will talk about having their FU money, that fund that allows them to choose whatever projects they would like, and hands the power back to them. But obviously that's something of a rarity. And much of what I'm talking about is related to managing successful careers or sustaining institutions or making the argument for public funding of the arts. But the degree to which artists need or choose to engage in these matters varies greatly. And I want to talk about a couple of perhaps slightly strange examples, but they're the best examples I know. Artists who deliberately choose to have nothing to do with the sort of power structures that I've outlined. One of my favorites is Daniel Kitson, who is a writer and a comedian and a theatre artist. And Daniel has no managers. Whenever you see a list of the best, if you ask comedians who the best 10 comedians in the world are, Daniel will often be number one in this. But he has no manager, no agent, no PR. And if you want to do a Daniel Kitson show, you have to email him, and he probably will not email you back. And if he does, he will tell you when he wants to play, how much the tickets are going to be, and they're going to be very inexpensive, and exactly what he is going to expect. Often he won't tell you the name of the show, and the venue he will play will be far smaller than his appeal. So there's no requirement for marketing. The shows are always sold out and the work is usually very good. Daniel does not apply for any public funding, won't have it acknowledged or any sponsorship on it. He will not appear on television and he won't do interviews, and he has no interest in going out with you for dinner after the show. He's not rude about these things. He just has chosen to completely remove himself from any element of influence, perhaps beyond that of his audience. Another artist who I've worked with a little bit is who I'd say has complete indifference to existing power structures was Lou Reed, who obviously passed away shortly a while ago. Lou saw no need to be engaging, and he saw absolutely no need to explain himself to anybody. He simply didn't accept the premise of authority of administrative or curatorial personnel. And I might take it further and suggest that he didn't even accept the authority of the public in their judgment of his work. He essentially rejected any attempt to have any control over his work or his life. Above all, he never accepted the authority of the media and gave interviews, I often feel, just purely for his own amusement. There are many other artists who I think I would put in the same category. The great pianist Martha Argerich, and perhaps more recently the Edinburgh-based band Young Fathers, fiercely independent artists who have no role to play within these various power structures. Obviously, there's a whole other discussion to have about rock and roll and perhaps punk rock and its repudiation of power structures, and how popular music has moved back to accept many of those structures and embrace them. The one player who I think has completely relinquished power in the arts over the past 2 decades has been the media. I don't need to explain to this room that the demise of the traditional media and the rise of social platforms have just changed things irrevocably. But for an organization such as the festival, there are no longer commentators who can champion a new voice or contextualize a movement in a way which will bring the public's attention in the mass sense to something that is utterly unfamiliar. Critics and editors who could carry an audience past their prejudices and guide them down new paths simply don't have the column inches or the budget to do so anymore. And indeed, the very existence of the arts and media that was a media that was universally consumed within a community, it gave it a standing and a profile that it can never enjoy in the sort of hyper-customized social media world. When an entire town would pick up a paper and you would bump in against things you'd no interest, like bridge or greyhound racing, at the same time those people would bump into the arts, whereas the far more specialized nature of social media means that we simply don't bump up against those things. The flip side of that is that the arts in the UK, at any rate, are no longer subject to the whims of a very small group of critics and editors who tended to see everything through the prism of their London-based lives, which was not always helpful. Finally, I just want to touch upon a group of people who mightn't immediately come to mind when we talk about those who influence or who have real power on the way we consume culture and the way culture is made. And that's architects and planners. One of the first things you have to consider when you arrive in a city to program a festival is the cultural infrastructure of that city. Edinburgh houses the biggest Fringe festival in the world because it is a city full of big churches, assembly halls, and drafty university lecture halls. Hong Kong, on the other hand, was a space with no real estate available for culture and is now trying to build an entire cultural infrastructure along this piece of reclaimed land, the West Kowloon Cultural District. But due to a real estate situation, essentially the culture had been pretty much destroyed for many, many years. And at a more granular level, the design and build of venues will always shape what will go into them. I mean, I remember arriving in Edinburgh and your head is full of ideas, and then you have to go and do the walk around the venue, and you begin to think about all of these different types of things you're going to do, and then you walk in and you have the 2,500 seats of the Usher Hall, and then you have the 1,800 seats of the Festival Theatre, and then you have the 3,000 seats of the Playhouse. And so when you get down to the 1,200 seats of the King's, it's something of a relief. Or indeed the 900 seats of the Queen's Hall seems positively boutique by that stage. So I think that the possibilities of the performing arts are defined by the cultural infrastructure that we inherit and the infrastructure that we leave behind. I think cultural infrastructure often benefits and suffers from the fact that its civic representation is of how a city would like to be perceived to be, as much as it is a practical place for artists to make their work. Here are two of the most prominent projects currently coming to completion. This is the Factory in Manchester. Every new cultural space has to have young people going crazy at some point in the future. And in New York, the Shed. These are both what they call multi-genre open spaces. And then there's a very interesting imagination of what might happen in these spaces. Again, certainly nothing as gauche as a play. And inside, there's something strangely Orwellian about both of them. But I think that I do think in these spaces it begins to say how people want to be seen. I mean, in this city we have obviously the Usher Hall and the McEwen Hall, which were obviously built by two of the great industrialists of that time. And you see very quickly in those spaces what Edinburgh wanted to say about itself. But here, clearly, both New York and Manchester want to say something about modernity and a change in genre, and within these spaces here, obviously, digital work, but without actually saying what it is, and without any particular reference to whether or not it's going to be suited to the artists. However, I completely accept at the same time that you'll see that public space is far more important in these conversations than it was before. And I think that public space and the relationship with public space as well has a very important role to play in terms of the cultural life of a city. And Edinburgh has a very interesting relationship with public space because there are quite a lot of very beautiful spaces in Edinburgh which in any other city would be public space, but which are in fact private. And there's always a very interesting pull and push with public space in Edinburgh as to what degree it should be used. Obviously, we are looking forward in 2021 to the development of a new mid-sized concert hall at the back of Dundas House in St Andrew's Square. And certainly from my perspective, that will represent the biggest change in the programming palette of the festival for a very, very long time. Mid-scale concert halls are certainly where people are going at the moment in terms of being able to develop music. And certainly in terms of electronic music, in terms of new music, and even looking at things like early music, finding the space to be able to broaden the conversation, because if you have spaces like the Usher Hall, there are many wonderful things you can do there, but in terms of actually bringing the form forward and bringing audiences forward, the infrastructure defines it. So those people who are party to the design and development of new infrastructure dictate what is going to happen culturally for generations. And perhaps we don't always give that planning process or that discussion the weight it deserves. And sometimes we turn around and a venue has just popped up. Not so much in Edinburgh, it has to be said, but in other cities, they are done at a pace and we don't fully accept. I often think that the best cultural venues are the ones that are built by existing companies, because then you get the granular detail of the presence of the artist. I think the worst are the ones that are built exclusively by municipalities. So I think that this is both in terms of the architectural work and how they sit within the public space in the city. I think that there is a power dynamic that needs an awful lot of thought. So what I've tried to do here is take a quick snap or draw a sketch of a moving object. I'm just going to put up some pictures of, these are some pictures taken by Beth Chalmers, who spent her August lurking around in rehearsal rooms and dressing rooms as artists prepared to perform this year. But I wanted to give a sense of many forces that are at play, and I haven't hit upon all of them, but to give you a sense of all of these levers of power, the visible and the invisible, and the consequences of the decisions we make. But I suppose, having asked the question, who's running the show, I have to give it an answer. At the end of the day, I have to say that artists still run the show. This doesn't mean that they make the most money. It doesn't mean they decide cultural policy or decide indeed what's going to go on a concert hall platform or on a gallery wall. But the exchange between the artist and the audience trumps everything else, and it drives all potential. Others might have a different approach to the way they approach the curatorial process, or indeed the managerial process, and they may be able to achieve different things to me. But I've always believed that my role as a curator and a producer and a manager is effectively servile. And perhaps it is growing up in a house full of artists that I've seen the most effective way is to understand that you are in the service of artists, and you have to be very careful about not trying to refract their work through your prism too much. I think there's something in the look and the tension and the concentration and the preparation in those photos that makes you realize just before a performance is about to begin. That's my favorite moment. And the auditorium is about to fall into darkness. All of the marketing material is now in the bin. Stakeholder management is forgotten and inconsequential. And an artist walks on stage and it's just you and them. And it is an encounter that could possibly change your life forever, or it could be the most excruciating 2 or 3 hours you've had in some time. But to a degree, all of these elements I've talked about tonight are essentially glorified stage management. It's complex and it's infuriating stage management, and it may have required conflict and patience and generosity and the commitment of hundreds of thousands of people. But at the end of the day, it is all stage management nonetheless. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I just wanted to invite, if you have any questions at all, I'd be very happy to take them. Thank you.
Well done. Do you want to... So thank you, Fergus. If that was barstool speculation, then I think that's a bar that we'd like to be in any night. So I know we have 2 people with microphones walking around. I can't actually see the audience at all, so it would be helpful to slightly lift the audience lights. And, oh, thank you. And if you could just put your hands up if you'd like to ask a question, and wait till the microphone comes towards you. And we'll take a few questions, and then later there's going to be drinks downstairs and there's opportunity for further conversation with Fergus. So can I see if there's an initial question? Oh, Neil, yes.
Thank you, Fergus. That was great fun and also very thought-provoking. I guess one sceptical view would be around the conclusion that the artists are running the show. And I was thinking about your story about the Catholic Church and the sideways word from the... I'm sorry?
I hear you.
You can't hear me? Oh, I'll speak louder. And microphone closer. Well, I'll start again. So the question, I was trying to challenge the idea that the artists are running the show. So thinking about the story about the Catholic Church and the literary festival in Ireland, and that casual word that could derail the whole programme. And I was trying to think about now, is there any situation where what an artist is doing would provoke that casual word from anyone in power in this country? Can you imagine that? Or is it in fact the case that what artists do they're not running anything in a sense? The art spectacle is running, but it doesn't have an impact, I suppose. And in that sense, they're not running any show.
I mean, I guess I meant that they're running the show in the sense of everything else is just background noise, and then eventually there's a moment, there's an encounter between an artist and the public. And so everything else, obviously, as I said, it doesn't necessarily, somebody may never get their work seen, but all of this is still essentially bureaucracy. It's not the process itself. I mean, the scenarios whereby, I don't know if someone could say a word so something wasn't said. I mean, obviously, there's a question as to whether kind of counterculturalism has been hijacked by the far right now. And you could imagine a scenario where someone with particularly far-right views would be forced off the platform, funnily far more than in any other scenario. I guess the other scenario is, and this is sort of increasing, is the question of protest. I don't know if it's an individual, but certainly the presentation of artists from particular countries. I can see scenarios whereby, and I know both say kind of overtly and covertly, where artists are not presented because it's either politically unpalatable or just the degree of protest would make it impossible.
Thank you. Other questions? Oh, Chris over there.
Thank you, Fergus. That was a wonderful lecture. I was particularly interested, well, I was interested in all of it, but your comment about the death or the decline of the traditional critic or the print-based critic and the power that critics might have held a generation or less ago, that you were placing in the context of social media. I suppose if I was to offer another interpretation of who's running the show, then I guess it would be the big conglomerates that are supporting social media, the Googles, the Facebooks. Do you think that's that is a replacement, that the voices are just dispersed critical voices, or?
I mean, the thing is, I think when social media started off, there was this sense of, it doesn't matter if you're a Fringe show or you're us, we're all, it's a level playing field now. But obviously that's not true now, because if there are two things going and one of them is paying Facebook, they will make sure that that other voice is not heard. And at least with the media, there was, not in every case, but there was, you know, there was the attempt towards some kind of editorial independence, whereas those are essentially advertising functions. I think there's still critical writing, but what there isn't within the social media world are real influencers. I mean, you know, there's that question of has the swarm sort of replaced it in any sense? And it hasn't. So what it does is it makes kind of, there are ways, I think people have become very tribal in terms of the way they follow things now. And so it makes kind of a point of contact. It makes an actor in something, or I know there's always been a star system, but in a sense that star system I think has become more pronounced. And so I think it's part of but the star system can be quite diverse, but it still is very much the idea of saying, if we had introduced Pina Bausch and had heard who they were, there were critics who would get a double-page spread in The Observer, which was read by 80% of your audience, who contextualized the work and said, this is important, and overnight it would be something, it would have that gravitas. That doesn't exist anymore. So the unfamiliar has definitely become a more difficult proposition.
Thank you, Fergus. I'm interested in whether you touched on the climate that we're currently in, with revelations about people's private lives affecting the platforms that they're allowed to occupy, the work that they're allowed to do. I'm interested in whether your personal morality or a sense of morality that you carry on behalf of the organization would affect your programming decisions. Say it came to an artist like Louis C.K., for instance. If you program someone on the basis of their work and then something comes out about who they are as a human, where do you take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if someone has been, you know, particularly accused of something, that's kind of in a way quite straightforward. I think the big question that all of us are having is the question of the auteur, in a sense, and the elevation of the auteur to a degree of kind of authority. and whether that was enabling behaviors. I think as well the situation we are all in our industry is that we come together and then we break apart again. So I think within a sort of a formal institution, there are the usual kind of protocols. But what we end up doing is stepping into a protocol with a conductor or a director or whatever else, with an incredibly strong protocol, with a person with sort of absolute authority at the top of it. But they're not party to the same kind of employment protocols that you would have elsewhere. And I think that there's a big question as to how you properly legislate for that, I think is it. And also whether or not there's something kind of, whether that degree of authority is necessary for the creation of great art. And, you know, I mean, we're talking about great artists, and the question obviously of specific abuse of a sexual nature, but, you know, just about the fact of, are we talking about people who are monsters, you know? It isn't necessarily in the form of sexual harassment, but should we tolerate that? And to what degree, you know, is there anything in terms of the nature of marshalling 200 people around a stage and creating something that is necessary in that, or is it just a sort of a bad habit we've gotten into?
Would you take someone out of your program if you felt that they had been revealed to be a negative human? Would you feel that affected your artistic decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in terms of if there was abusive behavior, I'd like to think we would. There's an interesting question as to whether you think they're a bad person or not. That's another question. There's the question of the morality of the individual artist. You know, I mean, I don't mean to sort of you know, widen something that's very particular and difficult at the moment, but, you know, there are questions even of artists who are no longer living, and as to whether or not their own morality and their own behaviours should mean that we should question the presentation of their work. But certainly in the case of and it's a big conversation we're having, how do you make sure that you manage behaviours when you have so many people coming through and you keep setting up these kind of lines of authority that are absolute?
Thank you. Have we any other questions? Yes, we've got two here, so if we take the one on the left first. And then I suspect after these two we might want to retreat somewhere where it might be warmer, possibly. Yes.
We're talking about power in the festival and where the power lies. At what point does where the power lie become an untenable position and need correcting? What are the checks and balances in it?
Do you mean in terms of the authority of whoever happens to be at the top of the institution? I mean,
more as how it functions between the financial, the artistic, talking about specific artists, and you as, I'll use the term coordinator for a better one.
Yeah.
Between the power of the three, at which point, what are the checks and balances to keep the say in the festival equal amongst them?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about festivals, as I said, we don't really have assets. So, you know, there's a natural check and balance, which is that you become insolvent very, very quickly. But I think it's interesting in that there has been traditionally a kind of a festival director role which has had to incorporate the two. Because particularly with a festival, every financial decision is an artistic decision and vice versa. You decide you're going to do this and that means you can't do that. And so you're constantly working with that. I mean, it's an interesting process. We're right in the middle of it at the moment, which is just how you pull everything back. You'll usually find that an organization that hits hard times will have incredibly strong checks and balances. And sometimes you actually have to push your governance function to really apply the governance, to really make the checks and balances apply in a very real way. The flip side of that is if the checks and balances become too onerous, what happens is people start interfering, and they use those checks and balances as a way to sort of start kind of involving what's going on. But I mean, from our point of view, there's a very strong kind of board of directors who we have to answer to in every way. And then internally, there's a very good system in terms of risk management, and a very realistic system of risk management. So it exists, but I think with a festival like ours, there's also the benefit of 70 years of knowing what's going on. But I think our board would pull us up pretty sharpish if we were to push the risk function too much. That's why she's on our board.
And the last,
would you be the sacrificial cow then? Would you be the sacrificial cow?
What if someone had to be fired? Oh yeah, oh yeah. I'm the only one with an end date on my contract.
Fergus, we've so far managed to avoid the B word, and B is for budgets, and it's also for Brexit. And I'm just wondering whether you are facing any difficulties in terms of future issues around contracts, as to where power and persuasion may lie in terms of future financing, given, you know, the Creative Industries Federation is today given its budget response, and I'm sure the heritage sector will too. Where is that future power and shift of balance and influence and contract going to go, do you think? Or do you think it'll remain very much the status quo?
Yeah. I mean, since I arrived in Scotland, there was a referendum on independence, there was a referendum on Brexit. I don't know how many other elections we've had. So it's constantly shifting. I mean, obviously we've got a very interesting scenario where we've got the rise of the city as a kind of, not just Edinburgh, but the rise of the city as an independent kind of institution with its own kind of cultural policy. Here we've got national government and we've got Westminster government. So from that point of view, we're always trying to figure that out. I mean, there's no immediate contract issues in relation that are starting to kick off. The only big issue, to be honest, is whether there's going to be an economic downturn. And that's really the most sort of tangible thing. We are completely dependent on tourism in every way, but also just you know, the general prosperity of the city. So, I mean, like so many people, I think the main issue is just that we're in eternal wait and see mode. And so I think that throughout the recession, I think it was fair enough that everyone had to say, we just don't know. We'll get through this year and we'll see what happens. And so we now seem to be in a constant state where you say to people, let's really talk about the future. And they just shut that down really quickly. And so it's very difficult to have a conversation as to where the festival should be in 10 years, because when you try to have it, people go, where are we going to be in 3 years? And that's, I think that's just hampering strategic thinking. That's the sort of the sadness of it in a way. And people, I mean, I know it's a big issue in terms of just investment, but you know, you would hope that in a period of time we're going to get beyond that. But I think we've lost in cultural policy. I think we've lost a lot of the ability to think long term at the moment, because we've constantly been moving from one thing to the next, and you know, going from one year to the next is a sort of a wasteful way of doing things, in a sense.
Good. Well, I think at this point we'll round up. But just before we go downstairs to the reception, I'm going to hand over to Stuart Bennett.
Thank you, Dorothy. Hello, I'm Stuart Bennett. So I'm the acting principal of Edinburgh College of Art. I've just got a few thanks that I want to give on behalf of the college and the university. So I'd like to thank the following people. Adele Conn, who unfortunately can't be here because she's injured her leg, I think. The events officer, and Ryan Buchanan, the events administrator, who made all this happen. Neil Cox for tomorrow's workshop with Fergus and all the organisation with the staff and students around that. Shailing Yang as the ECA External Engagement Director, who's been very involved in this process. Chris Breward, who I know is here, and Martin Parker, who's also here, for initiating the contact with Fergus and making this happen in the very early stages. Dorothy for chairing the Q&A so wonderfully. And finally, as someone who trained as an artist and through some strange quirk of fate finds himself involved in curious forms of stage management on a daily basis now, I really appreciate the tone and the message of your lecture, Fergus. So thank you, and please do all join us for a drink downstairs and join us in thanking Fergus once more for a wonderful lecture. Thank you.